Okay, thank you. So I'd like to start off with this image of the blood vessels in your brain. So you can just see how rich and full the vascularization of the brain is. It's really the interface between the body and the brain. Like almost everything that happens in the brain depends on the blood vessels. So today I want to tell you the story of how blood vessels age and how that leads to aging of the brain. And in particular, how we think we can treat blood vessel aging as a new approach in dementia and Alzheimer's disease. But before we jump into that, I think it's really important to orient ourselves to think about what actually happens to people in aging, which is something that I think sometimes we lose sight of when we get really focused in on drug development. And to do that, I want to share some images with you. The first is from this project, Faces of Century, which is photographs of people when they were young and then when they reach 100 years old. So these are all 100-year-old individuals. And I'd like you to just sort of notice and reflect on whatever strikes you about these images. And then the second one is another really interesting project where this professor, Carl Baden, took a picture of himself every day over a period of decades. Every day. And everyone probably has their own observations, but what really strikes me is a couple of big ideas about aging. First is that different individuals don't age the same, which we saw in this series of photos. And secondly is that their aging is not linear, right? When we looked at those daily progressions of aging, Carl was healthy for a long period of time with really no signs of aging, and then had a pretty rapid change in his aging status towards the end of life. And these are not just sort of philosophical ideas about who we are, where we're going, why is this happening to me. This is actually really important for clinical trials in dementia because there's going to be a subset of people who are at much higher risk for fast decline into Alzheimer's disease and dementia. But when we go into clinical trials, it's been really challenging to actually capture that patient population because we don't really know why people are at greater risk. And because of that, in our clinical trials, we have a lot of relatively healthy people who may not decline for 10, 20 years. And it's really impossible to detect any drug effects when you have this mixed population of people who are basically healthy and not showing any disease in the placebo group. And that's made it almost impossible to develop new drugs for dementia, even if you have a good idea, which we don't. So let's go back now to thinking about these real people and ask ourselves, why do some people stay healthy and some people have aging? Well, in the brain and in dementia and Alzheimer's disease, it's very clear. The biggest risk factors by far to determine who is at risk for getting Alzheimer's disease are all lifestyle risk factors. Lack of exercise, obesity, smoking, diabetes. And what really strikes us about these risk factors is that they're all cardiovascular risk factors. So these are all the things that we're pretty familiar with that cause aging of our blood vessels. And we're understand how they can lead to heart attack, but there's a very special outcome in the brain for how these risk factors lead to disease. And we're at a point now where we're sort of starting to finally get a handle on dementia. And in part, that's through really wonderful collection of biomarkers and understanding what actually happens in aging people. And so there's this effort through the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative to look at hundreds and hundreds of patients across sites over decades. And what we see from the unbiased evaluation of all the biomarkers of brain aging and dementia is that the vascular risk factors, which are shown by this orange line, actually appear before any other aspect of brain aging. So you may be familiar with the field that there's been quite a lot of controversy and focus around amyloid beta and signs of neurodegeneration in the brain. But those aspects of brain aging appear much later in the disease. And before we see any other aspect of loss of health in the brain, we first see loss of vascular health. And this isn't, this is not my opinion. This is huge data sets of patients from the best Alzheimer's research labs. So we can actually see this vascular loss of degeneration of blood vessels in real time in patients. So I want to show you what that looks like. This is an MRI where we do a scan and actually look at loss of vascular health, where it results in leakiness. And so things from the blood start leaking into the brain, basically leaky pipes. The 20-year-old image, 30 years, 42 years old, 65, 76. This is actual leakiness of the blood vessels. So this is a tracer from the blood leaking into the brain through damaged and dysfunctional blood vessels. And so you see, again, this starts to appear, it can appear as early as middle age. Actually, we know that probably about half the people in this room may be showing already some early signs of vascular aging. If we could put you in the MRI. But it becomes more severe as we approach dementia. And through a sort of constellation of research, we now starting to have a very good understanding of how blood vessel aging actually causes brain aging. So to understand that, the first two important points that I really want to share with you is, one, this is the largest segment of patient population. So there's a lot of different things that you can see going wrong in the brain, but most people who develop Alzheimer's have vascular pathology that's sort of hidden and there in their brain, but has never been addressed before.
Also, it's when they started aging and looking at them. Did you monitor that as well?
So definitely there's a huge risk factor through diabetes. Diabetes is one of the biggest risk factors for aging or for dementia. And there's a lot of literature on that. So through these sort of understanding that this vascular problem exists, we now get to the point through a lot of research that we have a really good understanding of what actually happens to the blood vessels. And there's two key factors that really drive the pathology here. First is that high blood pressure causes a lot of wear and tear on the blood vessels and blood vessel degradation. And secondly, there's activated immune cells that are flowing through the blood that become dysfunctional in aging and release a lot of inflammatory disease signals. And factors like this and others hit the blood vessels in the brain and cause them to start to degrade and release then disease signals coming from the blood into the brain. And so the story of brain aging for most people is actually body aging. And when you lose your blood vessel health, then that disease from the degenerating blood vessels infiltrates into the brain and starts to cause what becomes neural dysfunction and dementia. And what's really important about this patient population is that when we identify them, we can see that they have a totally different trajectory into dementia than the relatively healthy population. So again, we can segregate these patients and look at the people who actually have vascular injury and biomarkers of vascular health. And wonderfully, or challengingly, I guess, there's this huge genetic risk factor, ApoE4, which you may be familiar with. So this is the biggest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And what we know now is ApoE4 is a lipid transporter that actually exacerbates and causes dysfunction of blood vessels. So all the people who are carrying ApoE4 allele who are at huge risk for dementia, we now know that what happens is they have accelerated aging of their blood vessels. And if we measure their vascular leakiness, they're at a much higher level than corresponding ApoE3 carriers. And so when we take these two biomarkers together and look at the highest vascular risk patients, ApoE4 with vascular pathology, which is this blue line here, we see that starting from cognitively healthy into mild cognitive impairment and dementia, over a period of 4 years, they have a very rapid decline, which is different from the relatively healthy dementia population who will develop Alzheimer's disease, but have that trajectory at a much slower level. And so again, this is a clinical population that's pretty much impossible to form clinical trial in. But if we can identify at-risk patients based on their vascular pathology, that all of a sudden becomes now a feasible treatment population where we really understand what's going wrong and can potentially treat it. So this has been the vision of Reservoir Neuroscience. We want to develop the first drugs ever designed to heal blood vessel pathology in the brain. And I'll tell you a little bit of the story of how we've approached this, in particular, how we brought in some novel technology to really expedite this huge challenge of trying to develop drug in a completely new area. And by bringing in this technology, we were able to actually speed up our drug discovery and move very quickly from a really cool idea to some small molecule candidates that we have now. So what we did at the core of our company when we started the company was we built an organ chip. So we actually grow human blood vessels inside of a microfluidic chip. So this is all human cells. It's very realistic and translatable to the real biology. It basically looks and acts like the blood vessels in your brain. Three-dimensional real flow through it. And what that allows us to do is actually measure different potential therapies and just let any inhibitor we're interested in, flow it through the blood vessel, let it engage with the biology, and see what works and what doesn't to heal vascular health and restore vascular integrity in a diseased blood vessel. And so through that, we've actually identified our first hit and moved through developing some novel chemistry that I'll tell you about. But this platform is amenable to really scaling up and doing a lot of drug discovery. We like to think of the blood vessels as sort of the undiscovered country for neurological disease. There's huge opportunities across multiple diseases where there's blood vessel pathology. So this is what some of the data actually looks like from our platform. This is an example of a set of potential targets that we thought might help blood vessels. And what we were able to do is stratify what works and what doesn't. So we see here a leaky blood vessel, measuring leakiness of that blood vessel in our chip. And then a number of different drug targets, some of which don't work. And what became our first hit in our first preclinical program, which is this target called the EP2 receptor. And I'm going to tell you about that biology and how it works. But what we first found is that apart from anything else we looked at, this has the most incredible effect on healing blood vessels back to the healthiest state that we can see in our organ chip, and far outperforms everything else we looked at. And fortunately, we're sort of at a place now, where there's a lot of exciting biology, including some fantastic work out of labs here in Stanford, and we can put together a really coherent story around how does this pathway, this activation of EP2 signaling lead to disease? And what we know is that when there's high blood pressure, this receptor is one of the first things that's upregulated on blood vessels. So it gets directly upregulated. It's not there in your healthy brain. And it also gets activated on those immune cells that I talked about. And so through this first aspect of brain aging, when you have wear and tear on your blood vessels, this particular receptor gets upregulated, and then it starts to signal a disease status into the blood vessels and causes them to start to become dysfunctional, leaky, and ultimately to degenerate. And in particular, it also ushers in immune cells and helps them infiltrate into the brain and cause more damage through the dysfunctional blood vessels. And we actually know as well a lot about the potential human efficacy of this pathway, because it's a subpart of this really well understood pathway, which is the prostaglandin signaling pathway. So if you've ever taken an NSAID like ibuprofen, you're familiar with COX-2 inhibition. It was actually, or COX inhibition, it was mentioned earlier as well. But these are a general pain relief and anti-inflammatory pathway. That's one of the most powerful ways to reduce inflammation in the body. And we know that this gives us like a natural human population of people who actually have been on something that's anti-inflammatory that might work on the blood vessels, that we can see what happens to them. And so we know that people who have taken NSAIDs for up to 2 years have a hugely reduced risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. So people who have been taking NSAIDs have a 30% reduction in getting dementia. So they're just not getting it. But when we actually look at the vascular risk patients, so people who are ApoE4 carriers, like I said, who are developing vascular pathology, the risk reduction of being on this NSAID is actually profound. And we see a 66% reduction. So in other words, if we go back to this room, potentially half the people in this room have vascular risk. And if you're on NSAID, you actually may not get dementia where you would have otherwise. Unfortunately, this is a really non-specific approach. If you're just taking chronic ibuprofen, you're probably at a pretty high risk for either heart failure, blood clots, or perforation of your ulcer and bleeding in your intestines, which are all really bad lethal side effects. So this pathway is not considered safe, even though it has one of the strongest effects of any epidemiological factor that we've ever seen for preventing Alzheimer's disease. Even at low dose, you have elevated risk, and it's not completely clear whether risk for side effects. It's not clear whether low dose, is efficacious. We don't have, I think, enough data at the population level to know if a low dose is efficacious. But this target that we hit on through our own organ chip screening sort of independently is actually one arm of this overall signaling pathway. So downstream of COX signaling, it's a selective arm that mediates the chronic inflammation in the blood vessels. So potentially this is a very safe way to get the same efficacy, but without the side effects that you get from hitting all of these other targets, which are the ones that are implicated in these various side effects. And so what we've done is now develop some novel small molecule inhibitors for the EP2. We actually got pretty lucky going from target discovery to candidate development because this is an area that there's been previous pharma work on. And so there was some really beautiful chemical matter, safe, selective, highly potent small molecule inhibitors that we were able to take into our SAR program and rapidly develop even better potential drug candidates. And so essentially, we took really nice drug-like compounds and then made them even more potent. So we now have sub-nanomolar potency, which is about the best you can get for a drug for really good ability to be able to engage and inhibit this target. And we also have some pretty good understanding of a proof of principle for how this drug can work. So what we need to do now is take our candidates that show great drug properties and optimize them for actually bringing to human clinical patients. And we're very fortunate because the biomarkers of human blood vessel aging are actually the same between rodents and humans. And so sometimes rodents are really crappy models. I'm sure you hear people complaining about that all the time, but their blood vessels look very similar to humans. And what we see is just this loss of vascular health and leakiness is very similar in rodents and humans. And so there's some very nice mouse models where the mouse will, in natural aging, develop loss of vascular health, and you see infiltration of blood proteins into the brain. You see this vascular leakiness. In stroke, around the site of stroke, you get spreading pathology and all the blood vessels start to lose function and become leaky. And so we can actually measure vascular leakiness in these animal models and use that to optimize our drug dosing. So do dose response studies, look at the level of drug that we need to heal the blood vessels, and then use that to plan out our human clinical trials for effective dosing to actually restore and heal vascular health. And in all of these models, there's some really nice evidence already. For example, I just want to highlight, this is from a beautiful work done here at a lab at Stanford. Aged mice were given a course of an EP2 small molecule inhibitor. And after being treated with this drug, they show a complete rejuvenation of brain health. So the neuroinflammation in their brain disappears and it looks like a young mouse, and their ability to perform cognitive tasks is also restored. Yeah, daily. And these small molecule inhibitors are actually very safe as far as we can tell. There's now chronic dosing studies in mouse and rat, and there's no side effects that appear. This idea of a selectivity within the pathway has been borne out now in rodent studies as well. And so what do we ultimately want to do with these drugs? Well, we can go back to this problem of mixed dementia patients and this heterogeneity where there's some people who are slow decliners, some people that are fast decliners, and we really don't know on a case-by-case basis without biomarkers who's at risk for getting the disease and for progressing into dementia. And using different vascular biomarkers, which are now very robust and can be applied uniformly across clinical trial sites, we can actually identify the highest vascular risk patients so that we know how to target the people who really would benefit most from this therapy, but they're also the largest patient segment and the ones who are most in need of intervention. So can this work? Obviously, we don't know and we won't know until human clinical trials, but we can go back to some of that end state data. And there was a large scale trial done with a selective COX-2 inhibitor, celecoxib, called the ADAPT clinical trial. That trial unfortunately was halted after a year and a half because of the safety concerns that I mentioned, cardiac failure, ulcer risk. It's a good point to stop clinical trial. But what that data set gives us is the chance to do a retrospective analysis of what happened to the outcomes of the people. And what was found in retrospective analysis is that if you look at the highest risk vascular patients, people who are enriched for being ApoE4 carriers and who are showing that rapid trajectory of cognitive decline, essentially this target population that we're talking about, that population showed a completely different outcome from being on the celecoxib inhibitor, wherein this population declines very quickly with vascular risk, but that decline was completely halted and their cognitive outcomes were rescued by being on this NSAID.
Sorry, what's being measured here? What's the y-axis?
These are the cognitive outcomes in 3MS, which is a neurological exam of cognitive ability.
Do they have this data separated between ApoE4 and 4/4?
So it's either single or dual carriers show the same
But do
outcome.
you see that dual carriers decline much faster? So do you show that they should have a stronger efficacy?
Yeah. So this is just general risk. So single and dual carriers are combined. But what we know from this larger clinical study around just the biomarker risk is that this trajectory here is not different in terms of vascular enriched patients who have ApoE4. Okay. So if you're a single carrier or a dual carrier of ApoE4, there's no statistical difference in your risk of decline if you're showing vascular pathology. So you need both biomarkers. They're single and dual carriers who don't have vascular pathology are not showing rapid cognitive decline. So you can still be healthy as an ApoE4 carrier. It's like a double hit risk. If you have high blood pressure, if you have aging of your blood vessels, all your outcomes are going to be worse if you carry the ApoE4 risk factor. But it doesn't cause you to have inherently terrible vascular aging. It's the combination of lifestyle, which gets exacerbated by ApoE4, and that happens with single and dual carriers.
And this is Columbia population where they all have ApoE4. Or has that been looked at with this type of?
I don't think that the vascular risk factors have been examined I'm not familiar with the Columbia population, but in a unique ApoE4 population, I haven't seen data looking at vascular outcomes. What most of the data is around is mixed patients, and then you segregate out the ApoE4 carriers.
Question here. So it's implicit in the beginning of your presentation that at the age of middle age, 45 or so, we should have regular brain scans in order to have a baseline, like we do everything else.
I think that would be ideal, and it's actually very feasible at this point. But that's not necessary for treatment, potentially. That's ultimately, I think, long-term, what could be the strongest preventative approach, where we're still in the medieval ages around dementia, right? Where these kinds of understanding of the disease are relatively new, and without being too controversial, we've been a little bit trapped in a single therapy approach around amyloid beta. So, ultimately, in the long term, the best way to approach dementia will be to start doing routine scanning like we do for other diseases, cancer risk, colonoscopy, things like that around middle age and identify the vascular risk patients. And if you intervene with a drug or even with lifestyle changes, that's where you can have the strongest approach. However, we believe in a first clinical trial, there's a lot of opportunity even at the mild to moderate phase, because that's when the vascular pathology can still be healed, but you don't yet have neurodegeneration. And that would be more, what's estimated by this clinical trial, where people are already showing early signs of dementia, and you can see a potential effect of cetotoxin. So yeah, I'd like to just thank our team quickly. Co-founder Vlad, who's here. We built this drug discovery platform. We were able to recruit some of the best experts on EP2 chemistry who actually worked on previous pharma programs and bring that small molecule expertise into the company to develop these drugs quickly. And we have some wonderful advisors and investors, including Rodent. So yeah, happy
To use your biochip as a foundation for strategic partnerships with candidates.
Yeah, so what we're working on now, initially it was most important for us to use it for drug discovery and to try to get the right targets. What we've just done is completed our first prototype of miniaturizing and scaling the chip. So by miniaturizing it, we're now able to do large scale drug screening, which does open up potential for partnership, potential in-licensing, screening other people's compounds, and also doing large scale unbiased library screening.
Right, great.